Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome for a special edition of the Livestream Hour, Your Questions Answered. After our session on restoring automotive production in the new normal, we had so many questions coming in, about impacts on the supply chain, about production process, how they change, and we just didn't have time during the hour that we had together last week, and so we've come together for a bonus track. And I'm really pleased that I can welcome back my two panelists, my partners in crime here on the panel, Ralf Bechmann, partner, ROI Management Consulting, and Nick Holt, editor of Automotive Manufacturing Solutions. So I just want to check that we're there. Nick and Ralf, can you hear me? Are we there? Ralf is there. Fantastic.
Fine.
Great. All right, Ralf, Nick, thanks for joining. Thanks for joining again. I said we had so many interesting points in discussion last week, and things continue, in this fast-moving time to update and change ever more. I think, we're seeing a few more plants open up this week, in Europe. So some of the plans continue. Perhaps interesting to note, and I'll come back on some of them. We've also even seen some early signs of some of the key difficulties with a few manufacturers, which maybe we can come through as we come to some of the questions. So I'm going to move us right along here. So I've grouped together some of the questions as they came in last week into some sections to kind of cover off, and we can kind of take them in a group or sometimes individually because they're related. And I think the first set of questions really were around tier supplier impacts, sourcing, and the impacts there. So I'm just going to pop them down so that we can refer back to them. But let's start with this first one here, which is, will tier ones be better off than the OEMs or worse as we go deeper into and come out of the crisis? So kind of a point there. I think there's no question that we're all in this bit together, and I don't know that anybody really is so much better off. But maybe if I could just turn to Nick first for a moment on that one. Do you want to give us your view on from a production point of view, perhaps? Who might be better placed to weather this?
Well, everyone's suffering, obviously. My insight into this is prior to the shutdown caused by the coronavirus, talking to tier suppliers, mainly tier ones, they seemed very exposed to variations in demand with markets even back then, even a year ago. And so it was proving hard for them to regulate their production as efficiently and as effectively and cost effectively as they might like. So in that instance, you could see them being quite exposed because of the capital investment they have to make in equipment and materials, etc. So my view is that the tier suppliers are to some extent more exposed currently than the OEMs. But
yeah, and I think just to sort of maybe recap slightly what Ralf spent a lot of time talking about last week was the kind of need for these risk assessments and health checks, if you like, across the supply chain. And clearly, Ralf, we talked quite a bit about some of the big risks, perhaps especially at the tier 2 or tier 3 level, even equipment and tooling providers, which might struggle in the liquidity, and perhaps even more critically, of which OEMs or larger tier ones might not have the best visibility of. So clearly, that's where we've identified some of the big risks as well. Kind of moving to the next. Yeah. Did you want to add anything to that, Ralf, or is that sort of?
No, absolutely. Fully agree with you that we will see some massive risks in the supply chain, and of course. I'm not quite sure if this is really something that the OEM will win in this game, but I think there's some tier 2s that will come that are currently in good shape, and they will get additional opportunities in the market, looking at M&A activities, etc. And
absolutely. So we had another question. I'd welcome the panel's comments on the tier N interplay if industry loses suppliers and there's increasing competition for reduced critical suppliers. So that perhaps touches a little bit on what we were just talking about there. Perhaps especially if the industry does lose. Now, I don't think we haven't seen it yet, as we talked about last week, but we certainly could as this kind of goes on. Any other further points on that, Ralf, around the, in terms of increasing competition for reduced critical suppliers?
So first of all, I think there's the question if we will lose suppliers in this game, because if it's a supplier that's relevant for the OEM, this supplier will be financially and operationally stabilized by the OEM. I think that's pretty clear for me. In addition, if we are seeing industry losing suppliers, that means expected supplier consolidation. We will see increasing M&A activities in the supplier space, and that means financially strong suppliers, of course, will extend their business, will create additional opportunities, and will be finally in a stronger position towards the OEM because of less competition in the supplier market, but even because they have a stronger product portfolio. Yeah. And with this, what we call so-called mega suppliers, we will see stronger collaboration on OEM, OES level. That means it will be even more collaboration in between. But not to forget, I think we will see stronger and increasing cost pressure if you look downstream to the tier Ns. So it will be a different game for the tier Ns and compared to the tier ones. Yeah.
Interesting point there. That I mean, we've seen the growing strength of some suppliers. In terms of the values that they bring to the overall vehicle. So it could be quite interesting to see, as you indicate, if we haven't even emerged with even greater share of these sort of major suppliers, or tier 0.5s, 0.5s sometimes called. Let's move to some of the other questions here, and I think there's two questions here around global sourcing, if you like, or related to. So this first one is, how can European and US-based OEMs currently produce in China without the parts from the Europe and US due to shutdowns? Which I think is an interesting point, and one which, if I might just quickly say, from some of our reporting at Automotive Logistics and Automotive Manufacturing, we have heard from contacts who certainly do suggest that the Chinese some automotive manufacturers and suppliers in China certainly would run out of parts from Europe at a certain point and would have some constraints. And that would be especially the case, obviously, for the likes of sort of German OEMs and things. But that is not to kind of take away from the fact that China is highly localized and has a very strong, solid domestic supply base. So maybe, Ralf, from your point of view, do you see that as a risk point for China's recovery, ongoing recovery? And as we had in January, when Europe and North America were starting to run low, and risks of supply out of China probably would have been disrupted had they not been entirely disrupted by the crisis. The inversion of that is likely to happen. Is the inversion of that likely to happen now?
Yeah, I think increasing localization, I think that's a must. And every OEM, at least every OEM I know, has some good localization degree in China or in Mexico or wherever. So at least from my point of view, if you have a local for local manufacturing strategy, you will come probably stronger out of the crisis and will not so hit as OEM that have a global for local manufacturing strategy. So localization is something absolutely necessary to survive in this crisis. And if you haven't done so before, you need to do it after the crisis, restructuring your supply chain from local to global.
And I think that goes for China as well. And from what I understand, that's something that the Chinese supply base. I mean, I've seen figures. They still import a fair amount, but clearly, if it's 90% now, I think, or 80% now, there's lots of supply OEMs will be looking to increase that further. And I think that leads into the next question here. Really, related to the point of moving to more local suppliers in some instances, and this is kind of related to the cost question, really. So if we kind of were to take in the fact that there could be higher levels of domestic supply, there could even perhaps in some cases be higher inventories, certain aspects. You know, are we likely to see higher, in this case, piece prices for the sourcing, or perhaps even more broadly, increases in overall manufacturing costs? And is that you know, potentially a competitive risk? So maybe you want to start with that, Ralf.
We won't see. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. As from my point of view, we won't see higher piece prices because, to my expectation, we will see additional cost reduction initiatives, of course, material cost reduction initiatives driven by the OEM. And in addition, what we have seen is what I've just mentioned, this local for local manufacturing strategy. We have already in the automotive industry a high level of localization efforts, or had a high level of localization efforts over the last couple of years. And if you look at China, it's something in between 80 to 90% maybe localized content. Nevertheless, the problem, and I think that some OEMs are struggling with, is what we call the Tier N in-depth localization. That means what's happening with the Tier 2s, Tier 3s that are not localized. And what we see in addition is that OEMs, so say on the one hand side, of course, need to increase the local content if they haven't done so, but they need to decide what kind of risk they really want to take. Yeah? And that means on the one hand side, improving their proactive supplier risk management on the one hand side, and on the other hand side, be prepared for distressed suppliers, having some good supplier stabilization programs in place. And that means for the OEM, once again, we're talking about stronger collaboration. Yeah? The OEM needs to set up together with his Tier 1 suppliers some kind of global supplier plans. He needs to understand where the supplier is going to, what he's doing with his supplier base, setting up a good pre-supplier management on Tier 1 level, etc. Yeah? So on the one hand side, yes, of course, we will see no increased piece price, at least from my point of view.
Interesting. You know, I think that's an interesting aspect to it. You know, maybe just briefly, Nick, on a touch point in terms of, you know, do you think that you know, if there was more distributed manufacturing and localized, that some of those cost increases would be potentially compensated by automation, for example, by you know, bringing costs down in other areas? We talk about, you know, EVs, for example, as likely requiring fewer parts and having more automation, therefore perhaps less affected, if you like, by some of the other considerations. Is that something you could see increasing, accelerating out of this?
I mean, the EV side is a slightly different aspect in one respect, because the parts supply is coming from slightly different suppliers than the traditional ones, shall we say. But I mean, going back to the cost of localized parts as opposed to imported parts, interestingly, I mean, if you go back to China, and Ralf pointed out there's a huge, I mean, over the last decade, huge amount of localization, and they are producing, I would class them as the higher value parts there. So if you look at powertrain and transmission, is a good example of that. The German OEMs would, when they initially set up a powertrain or transmission plant, would import some of the more highly engineered parts in to start with, because of the quality requirements that they have. But we've seen that change now, and they are developing their own supply bases there, localized suppliers, whether they be foreign sort of transplants or local. In this instance, we're talking about Chinese businesses, and also developing the technical skills, working with colleges, universities to bring the engineers forward. I know, speaking to Daimler at their engine plant in Beijing a little while back, and it was really interesting to see they were almost autonomous from the German supply base in terms of powertrain components, which are, you know, they require, if you're going to localize, it's very interesting to see where powertrain sits in that. If you're putting a powertrain plate in there, that's a sense of confidence in your supply chain, either externally or in your ability to grow the localized thing. So I think China is a great example of the fact that a lot of this high value tier supply material is there already. So as Ralf said, I can't see costs necessarily escalating. I mean, it would almost be down to the fact that, and I couldn't predict what, but as you've both been discussing there, the sort of beyond the tier twos, if suppliers are lost there, then obviously demand picks up, then small prices could increase overall. But I don't think that will affect ultimately at the tier one end, the system supply. I think that cost would be absorbed to some degree. So I can't see big cost increases coming across that side of things at the moment.
Okay, interesting. So let's take the last question in this section, which is kind of on a different tact. And I just thought it was an interesting perspective. It's more of a comment, really. So perhaps we don't, whether or not we have an answer or not. But the question was a comment in from an OEM, actually. And it was just as I wanted to underline a detail that's making things complicated regarding, the process of ensuring supplier readiness, which is that most of them are being required by government in some way to produce for the crisis. So whether it's masks or ventilators or other kind of frontline equipment. That's an interesting point of view, and I hadn't necessarily come across it before, which was that, is the frontline efforts that some companies are making possibly going to be a constraint later on as we go? I certainly know that there's other constraints around applying the health and safety, distancing and equipment into the production. But Ralf, I mean, have you encountered any aspects of that, or do you foresee potential around that? If with, kind of also bearing in mind living with the virus, so to say, so the health requirements may not go away so quickly, even as production starts to come back.
As from my point of view, the suppliers we are talking to, they are really focused on getting the ramp up done. Yeah. And of course, they are doing a lot of things in parallel, for example, this PPE manufacturing, etc. But they are really focused. They have set up all the task forces and they are working on this with high concentration together with their clients, means the OEMs, to get it done. Yeah. And this is something everyone is really focused on talking to. So it's not around something doing in parallel. No, it's really focusing on get things done.
Yeah. And maybe just a small point on it, Nick. And I know it's something that you were looking on. This is from the OEM side, but it's not necessarily that we saw some of that ventilator production sort of taking over assembly lines or taking over the main facilities, if you like. It seemed to be making use of some other facilities or warehouses, etc., to kind of produce some of this. So I'm not 100% sure that the suppliers really are giving over so much of their capacity at this time.
No, I agree. I think in the main it's relatively small scale, very simplistic assembly operations that they're performing at the moment, albeit very valuable to the effort that they're making. And I don't think it infringes. I don't think I'm not sure the mainstream media may have projected an image of car lines being replaced with ventilator lines, which is not the case. The OEMs and I'm sure the tier suppliers, they have the competencies, the processes, and often the space to be able to create essentially small scale assembly operations for this. And also they can implement that they have that know-how to implement that process. But as Ralf said, I don't see any of it being large scale takeover of plants or facilities in anything in a meaningful way that's going to inhibit their own ramp up of production that we're starting to see now.
Yeah. So but nonetheless, an interesting point made there from our panel, our commentator there. So clearly, as we go deeper, we'll certainly see if we're living with both sides. Let's move to the next sort of panel of questions, if you like, and we'll kind of group them as much as we can here. This was around production and automation, some of which we sort of touched upon. In terms of whether automation will help with some of the social distancing, for example. I think the first question there is quite interesting. The OEMs, which OEMs are more affected by the crisis, those that build to order or those who produce, more mass, let's say, built to stock. So as I'm sort of interpreting that question to kind of refer to, let's say, the different production order to delivery methods there, necessarily in terms of the market, about whether, you know, Audi will do better than Seat. But in terms of from a production supply chain point of view, Ralf, starting with you, do you think build to order is a tougher ask in the current environment and disruption than would be, you know, kind of more simpler model lines, or is it the other way around?
To be honest, I think the key problem that we will find in here is in the supply chain. So it doesn't really matter if you're having build to order or build to stock. Yeah. It really depends on what's happening in your supply chain. And as we see some tier one suppliers who are delivering to, so say, volume OEMs as well as to premium OEMs, we will see that this has the utmost impact. Yeah, I don't think that we see some difference, some additional difference in there. And you already mentioned the market. I think that's another hot topic, because of course everyone in the OEM space is driven by the market. Means build to order as well as to build to stock. And yeah, once again, for me it's the supply chain, and supply chain, that means has an impact on both. Both has to handle supply chain issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you add anything to that, Nick?
It depends how you define premium car makers and built to order. If you're talking about sort of the JLRs, the sort of BMWs, Mercedes, that kind of area, they are still producing cars with very similar supply chains to their much more higher volume models. So as Ralf pointed out there, the supply chain issue will affect them just as readily as it would do, even though the volumes are smaller. They often do a lot of part sharing and commonality across that. So I think the people producing higher volume, so more generic, even at the premium end, are going to be exposed, as Ralf said there, to the supply chain. If you go up further into the kind of Rolls-Royce, Ferrari, that kind of area, I think they're less impacted in many ways because their manufacturing operation is completely different. It's far more modular. They can space it out. The production time, takt time is so much slower as well. They can kind of stagger and perhaps flex things a little more. Where they do probably struggle is that their supplier base is less diverse. They are more reliant on specialist suppliers than perhaps a larger OEM that's producing hundreds of thousands of even premium vehicles. So if you have one of those suppliers of a particular type of fabric or a particular type of material, which they often use quite exotic materials, then they will be far fewer in number, and that will be much harder for them to withstand the financial shock of the thing. So they could be quite exposed in that respect. So, but I think on the whole, I agree with Ralf. I think it's hugely down to supply chain, and I think, you know, from the premium guys with Mercedes, BMW, JLR, those kind of guys, even right down to sort of the Toyotas and the Fords, they will be facing very, very similar things across the board at the end of the day. So,
good. So the next question here, was automation a way to deal with the social distancing and quality control issues with the fast ramp up? I think that was an interesting point you just made there, Nick, about very low volume production in terms of the takt times and stuff there. Wouldn't necessarily be because of automation there. I think that makes it more flexible, but still interesting. But what about that? Do you think, Nick, do you think the automation is kind of key to managing some of that social distancing?
With social distancing, I think it's being revealed each day. Actually, we're seeing the way that the OEMs are implementing social distancing. And I was reading around the last couple of days to see people are sort of essentially working from the same playbook of quite physical systems, barriers that they're putting up, makeshift barriers or whatever they might be. So I'm not sure how much automation necessarily in the short term plays in that. And also, I would see that automation, the social distancing requirement, we hope, is a relatively short-term requirement that because we were talking about, I think we were talking about in our original presentation about production levels starting at a very low level, so you can afford to space people out, you can run shorter shifts, lower volumes of people. But as you increase that, you won't have the space or the capacity. You'll need more people to do things. I don't think you can go out and buy a load of automation, in the coming month or even year that will replace what you have already. So I don't think it, in the short to mid-term, has any greater impact. And I don't think the speed of automation or the introduction of it will increase that much. If you talk to a line manager or even a plant manager about automation and have they seen the latest thing, they're very pragmatic about it. It's not a silver bullet for speeding up or improving manufacturing in every area. So they're very selective about it. It's not a cover-all. Having said that, automation is becoming far more sophisticated. We see with the sort of introduction of cobots now that are supplementing the workforce rather than replacing it. So there is a chance that things will become more automated with or without the this crisis that we're dealing with at the moment. So I don't see it as a short-term answer or even a mid-term answer in any great meaningful way. So
okay, so let's take the last question of this bit. In fact, we touched upon it somewhat last week, but I wouldn't, if we wanted to add anything to it. Ralf was talking earlier about the potential for suppliers to kind of, if you like, grow in significance in the wake of the crisis, in terms of some of the critical supply and major suppliers. But in this specific instance, questions around groups of suppliers collaborating to meet demand for modular solutions, likely to be undermined or potential to increase. Either of you have a particular view on that?
Yeah, of course. At least from my point of view, it will stay, and of course it will increase. Collaboration is, at least from my point of view, that's really key. I think we have mentioned it over the last couple of questions a few times. Collaboration between OEM, OES, that's really something that will increase. And of course, in addition, we see some additional massive change in the automotive industry that's not only driven by COVID-19, but really by what we call go electric. Yeah, so say from ICE to EV to BEV, and of course, yeah, we need higher investments. Yeah, we need really high investments to get it done, and of course, there's a question of risk management too. And having said this, we need OEM as well as OES working together to get this high investments implemented and to get all the wonderful innovations we're thinking about. Means on the one hand side, electric drivetrain, means autonomous driving, etc., to get this done. Yeah, and that's why it won't stop with COVID-19. No, I think it will continue and it will be even increased.
Nick, anything to add to that?
I agree. I think it will. I think it'll be reinforced. The COVID-19 crisis does obviously highlight various areas where collaboration is key, and a supply chain that is as weakened as it probably is at the moment needs to pull together to survive. So, and we've seen a lot of collaborations and joint ventures between the large OEMs who are now grouping together to pool resources. And it doesn't diminish if you step down from the car makers. With huge capital outlay, you look at the tier ones and what they're now being required, as Ralf mentioned there, with all the EV before the COVID-19 crisis, they're having to make similar requirements. They're being stepped up into much more of a partnership with the car makers, with their clients, and as such, they're making big financial investments, and you can see a lot of them buying up smaller companies with competencies that they don't have. And expanding. Is quite interesting to see that. They're interestingly becoming more vertically integrated, some of the bigger ones, in their manufacturing operations, buying up smaller companies that would ordinarily feed into them. So I agree with Ralf. I think it won't diminish. I think it will increase, and it will be reinforced and perhaps refocused slightly with the COVID-19 crisis.
Okay, thanks for that. Let's move to the next grouping of questions here, which were more focused on logistics issues in many ways, and logistics and inventory. One was, how do OEMs plan to change strategies in relation to storage at plants and ports. So before I kind of move to the other ones, which are maybe more specifically on demand there, if we, maybe Ralf, I don't know if you have any view on that in terms of if you kind of sense that there's likely to be a strategic change here in terms of how the storage and inventory is managed. Clearly there's a demand, there's a big demand question there too, but at the moment we are seeing some pile-ups of at ports, of containers, of vehicles, and I'm sure there's issues at the plants as well. So in terms of your clients, have you seen any indication of change here?
Yeah, of course, we will see increasing finished vehicle inventory at plants, especially around plants. That's simply because we are ramping up the plants again. And of course, there's still some inventory from before the crisis. Yeah. And that's why what we see at clients, they do, on the one hand side, add additional storage nearby plants, especially nearby plants. And on the one hand side and on the other hand side, drive, I would say, aggressive sales up programs to increase vehicle turnover. Yeah, because all the vehicles that might be manufactured now during the ramp up need a customer. Yeah, if they don't have a customer, we will find them in some vehicle storage, and that means set up your sales program. But I think there's another one. It's not only not producing cars or having a slow ramp up. If we look a little bit deeper into the current OEM plant ramp ups, we see they are ramping up mostly engine and engine components plants at the moment. For example, to supply to China plants. And over the next 2 to 3 weeks, we will see vehicle plants going live in Europe, Germany, Europe, and then we'll see what's happening. I'm quite sure we will see increasing vehicle storage nearby plants and at ports. Yeah. And we will see what's happening at the OEM plants then, if they are ramping down again, if they are doing some kind of a slowdown of the ramp up. And yeah, but this has to be, it's really depending on the market situation. Yeah.
Absolutely. And actually, I think that speaks to largely what I think some of the other questions here were. So obviously there's a question around with dealerships closed in US and Europe, the ports overall have space to handle and store cars, how much, and then there's also a question there about even using ships as sort of floating garages to sort of store the vehicle. So I think what you kind of mentioned there talks to that in terms of the need to handle that, and then clearly depending on the market demand. I mean, I can sort of report certainly that we know of ports and of shipping lines who are offering those sorts of storage options and looking at that. And then, I suspect that OEMs will be using them. Certainly, they're looking for temporary storage. Certainly, there's some strategic advantage to having some finished stock sort of ready for as things get turned back on. And it's probably at least important to note that German dealerships can start to reopen in some instances now in some states. A couple of other countries are moving in that direction and easing that. The US actually, a federal guideline just did come out that indicated that dealership sales can open. It'll still be up to the states to decide that, but the government is sort of on the federal level said that, so some will. So that's my mind. That doesn't open up the floodgates for demand by any stretch of the imagination, but there's at least some channels that these can move through, and maybe also through some online ones and a few other places. So temporary issue for sure that I think we're likely to sort of see. So I think that's a big key issue, and one that we'll continue to see. And I do think the ports have at least a temporary kind of issue and crisis to manage there. We also had a question on the strategies you would suggest when working with a 3PL, a third-party logistics provider, to manage the restart. I just thought maybe, Ralf, it's worth, if you have any views, because obviously we were talking a lot about last week about supplier health risk risk assessment task forces across different parts of the organization, perhaps also in conjunction with the supply chain. And so there is almost sort of say, it's like, well, okay, do you involve a 3PL in that as well? How does that extend to your freight partnership as well? I wondered if you had any kind of insight or comments you wanted to add on that.
Yeah, from my point of view, it all starts with setting up some kind of an emergency plan together with your 3PL in order to make really sure that you have the right capabilities, right logistics capabilities in place during your ramp up. And that means having your workforce ready at the 3PL, having the containers in the right place. I think we will see some logistics constraints in this place too. Of course, being flexible, and I think you need to have a flexible LSP who's prepared to react on these ongoing fluctuations in demand, inventory, capacity planning, that we will see along the supply base. And of course, you need transparency. That means you need to implement some kind of an ongoing supply chain monitoring to identify the bottlenecks in your logistics network that might show up. Yeah, for example, looking at cross-border travel, for example, GIS supply. You need to be aware of this, and you need to act accordingly. And once again, overall, collaboration. Yeah, but set up an emergency plan, be flexible, implement, get transparency, implement ongoing monitoring. I think these are the key points. Of your strategy you have to implement. And you can't wait for this. It has to be done now.
Absolutely. I think it's, maybe just as a small aside to note, which is interesting in terms of, 3PLs like other partners can help adjust to this new normal. Many of them will already have been involved likely in supplying and sourcing, for example, PPE equipment and things like that. And so actually there's skills and understanding and processes and even sources that can potentially be of use in this sort of planning into that new normal as well. So I think the key there is that the 3PL, equipment providers, IT providers are all part of that mix. The last bit on the logistics set of questions here, which I think again, it's about constraints in the system, assets, containers in the wrong place. Again, it's something we continue to see, and in fact, we'll have a bit more reporting on that specifically in an upcoming live stream when we have DHL coming on, who's going to talk about more specifics. But again, just not to go into too much detail there, but if we're looking at Europe, the borders still have points where there's long queues. With greater safety checks, we definitely see issues. There was issues on the German-Polish border. There's still issues on the Italian border. In the UK, we've got issues there. So there's lots of blank sailings out of China, for example, on the container shipping side. Air freight market completely disrupted still in many, many ways. So, these issues are far from gone. They're very much in the system, and I suspect, and you agree, Ralf, it's all part of the planning you were talking about. Managing and dealing with those disruptions is going to be a big part of the restart, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. Because I think we have to differentiate between inbound and outbound. Outbound, I think we have already discussed. We're seeing the finished vehicle storage, yeah, and there might be some shortage in storage capacity if you look ahead. Nevertheless, if you look at outbound, we have everything around time delay in cross-border supply chains, especially when we talk about GIS and JIT supply. We have disturbed container rotation and global supply chains, e.g. looking at China. I think you just mentioned this. And not to forget, we have talked about distressed part suppliers, but maybe we see some distressed logistics service providers too. Yeah, because when we talk about liquidity, short-term liquidity, there might be some problems in there too. Yeah. So what about logistics capacity in the market?
Absolutely.
So overall, there are some capacity constraints driven by several points.
Absolutely. And perhaps just a an interesting observation that I've had from several OEMs have mentioned to me. They think finished vehicle providers could be some of the risk points, because the highly asset driven, pretty much purely focused on automotive in many cases, so less opportunity as would some other carriers to kind of get involved with other commodities right now. So I think it's a key risk point. And we also mentioned as well the equipment and tooling suppliers being another one of those. So I think these risk points continue to be something that will we need to very closely monitor and have action plans around. That sort of leads into our last grouping, if you like. And again, I think some of these questions we can't go through them in loads of detail because something to do with forecasting and stuff, which we'll deal with that somewhat separately. But there's a couple of points here that I think worth kind of at least highlighting with our audience was thinking about. This comes back to the feasibility of an OEM starting in Germany in April. In this case, Daimler, but it can be set up at any of them. Tier one's not necessarily seeing call-offs in April. Well, how can they restart? I think what we've talked about throughout this past 40 minutes or so, in some cases, has already been the component suppliers and powertrains starting back up kind of first, and some cases to supply China, and clearly in other cases to supply other sort of plants. So I think I would guess that this is why it's not just being done overnight, that it's slowly ramping up across, and we're seeing that in some phases. Maybe just on that point, Ralf, have you seen, have you confirmed that? I mean, more tier suppliers are kind of starting up first, if you like, as we kind of get others going, or have you seen signs that maybe there's more delays because more of those suppliers aren't quite getting up to speed yet in time for these launches or restarts?
I think at the moment we are seeing no peak production. Yeah, we are still in the ramp up phase. We see 1 to 2 shifts at a max. Yeah, looking at vehicle manufacturing, looking at engine component plants. It's 1 to 2 shifts. We are seeing no peak production. That's number one. Localized parts, for example, in China, we discussed this. I would say it's nearly no problem. There are some problems, but I think this is, at least from my point of view, that's quite okay going on. We see a slow ramp up, yeah, of course, and we will see supply shortages, but these have to be explored, and these have to be mitigated over the next couple of weeks. Nevertheless, I think we discussed it before, that the one or the other OEM is already thinking about ramping up manufacturing or assembly again because of supply shortages. I think we will see this in some cases over the next couple of weeks. And this is probably something every OEM will experience.
Absolutely, and in fact, we covered that on AMS just today. That we know that we confirmed that Kia in Slovakia, the first OEM to restart in the first week of April, did run into supply issues and has shut down for several days this week. Expected to restart again in the coming days, so it wasn't a total. But nonetheless, I think that's just echoes what you said. This is probably part of a new normal. Those sort of disruptions, at least for the time being, probably likely to continue to happen. So, we'll see how that plays out. But we can already see that happening. So let's look at again, talking about, we had some questions here. I think that's sort of covered by the same point about the lack of a forecast. They have enough output in the market to open. Yes, clearly that will be a big determining factor, perhaps is equally, if not more important than those supply shortages. I think that's part of what we've talked about. But perhaps just to kind of come into that third question a little bit, which is really, how do you plan for maybe the really worst, which is if we do get another wave, what kind of happens then? And I think that's probably, that's not just a question for for the automotive industry at the moment, to say the least. That's a question that all our governments and societies are wrestling with. But especially from a supply chain risk and recovery planning point of view, what can we plan for that? Can we anticipate that, or is that's just part of this new normal?
At least from my point of view, if we would see a second COVID-19 wave, this would be like pushing the repeat button. Yeah, we will see plant shutdowns again, etc. All what we have already experienced during what we have now, so say wave 1. I'm quite sure this will really increase uncertainties in the supply chain. All the fluctuations in demand, inventory capacity we already see at the moment will be, so say, doubled. Yeah, and this will cause additional problems in the cash situation at several suppliers. So not only for the ones we already might see at the moment, but for an additional set of suppliers. And this will make ramp up afterwards even more difficult. So I don't want to think about a second wave.
No, certainly none of us do. I mean, Nick, do you think any point you want to add to any of that? I mean, clearly, we spent a lot of time last week talking about how the plants will adapt to some of this to kind of help prevent that. Again, that's not going to be specific to automotive. It's kind of all industries as far as we can see until we have an antiviral or a vaccine. But if there's any other points you would sort of add there, but I think we're certainly hoping not. We're hoping to avoid that.
No, absolutely not. I mean, from a practical operational point of view, they know the drill now. They had to shut down quickly because of and then it was kind of sitting to find out what was going to happen. Now they're beginning the ramp ups again. The supply chain is obviously an issue because anything kind of beyond tier 2. I think it'd be interesting to see where those supply shortages are coming from, how far down the supply chain it's affecting the supply of whatever it is, system components in those factories. You mentioned Kia there. I think it will be elsewhere as well. You'll probably see it pop up everywhere. So there's that issue that they're dealing with. I think from an economic point of view, how many OEMs and tier suppliers can deal with another shock, can deal with another stoppage. I think from an operational point of view, they're building in the social distancing, the hygiene issues, the scheduling of production at various levels, the operation of shifts and things like that. So they kind of got the playbook now to do that. So if someone said, actually, we're slowing down again, it's less of a shock in some respects, but absolutely not welcome, because it's the knock-on effect. The factories can start up again, but with the supply chain disruptions, which are bad anyway, I'm sure, as we're seeing, we will see more problems like that, and that's very unpredictable. Further down the supply chain you go, I think that's where we're going to see more problems. So I think the slow startup is a good thing. It gives everyone time to catch their breath. Everyone can kind of bring themselves forward at a pace. They can feel out what the supply situations are going to be, which regions, which parts, which areas are going to be a problem. Yeah, it's in one way I can see, yes, they're prepared, but in many ways it would be, I could see it being almost catastrophic to some extent for some businesses. So
yeah. So absolutely. Well, I mean, I think it's a good point on kind of having the playbook and certainly having some of the risk management. Let's not suppress ourselves with all the speculation on it. Perhaps one point I'd add to it is just to sort of say that we're arguably entering now is already a third wave, if you thought of China as first and developed markets as second, and we do see some trends here now to see that some of the developing world, whether it's parts of Southeast Asia, South America, Africa, are that third wave, and the degree to which that is contained, I think will be really kind of important as well. So depending on if those outbreaks in those regions turn into major catastrophes, as we arguably on the scale that we've seen in the developing world, it will be even worse to some extent because of some of the issues there. And I think it's inevitable that disrupts supply chains as well, even if they're not huge sourcing regions. I think they disrupt at the macroeconomic level. They disrupt at all kinds of levels. And so we're still very much in this, and that's why the new normal we talk about kind of anticipates a lot of this disruption. Yeah, I'm not sure if we have more to add on this one of these questions, but just in terms of this is whether any other macroeconomic factors like the inflation rate, unemployment, dealer bankruptcies, etc., affect the restart in the near future. So less to do with the second wave, more to do with the fallout, so to say. We've definitely talked about some demand and how demand will play such a key role in the sustainability of these operations moving up. But on that end of it, on the macroeconomic end, is that also a part of risk management, supplier health checks, or and beyond now, Ralf, in terms of as far as you're concerned in the next phase of the crisis?
Yeah, of course. But at least from my point of view, it really depends on the scenario. If you look a little bit more ahead, we were talking about this V scenario with a steep decline and a fast market ramp up, or we're talking about a U scenario with a steep decline, some medium or long-lasting recession, and some slow market improvement. And of course, this will drive on the one hand side unemployment, on the other side, for example, dealer bankruptcies, but not only dealer bankruptcies, but supplier bankruptcies. Looking at dealer bankruptcies, I think, at least from my point of view, this is an ongoing change. This is long started before COVID-19, and this will now even be speed up, because talking about his omni-channel sales, his online sales, etc. We will see that this has an additional impact on dealer bankruptcies that are now driven by COVID-19. So say speed up the process. Unemployment, of course, everyone's working on reducing unemployment rates caused by COVID-19. Looking at Germany, for example, the short-time work, but we will see. All depends on the market and the scenario that's behind.
Absolutely. Well, it's very fascinating points there on the dealer side. Of course, in the 2008-9 crisis, we saw a big shakeout of dealers, especially in the US and North America, and somewhat in Europe as well. And obviously, the kind of perfect storm of technological and changing issues around it. Very hard to predict at the moment, but certainly the dealer risks there do seem prevalent. Last question is a crystal ball question. I suppose you can argue I sort of clearly that's going to be the question on everybody's mind, is when any region can get back to 2019 sales levels. Definitely too soon to say with any certainty. From our business intelligence division, what I would say is that our current forecast, which looks at best case, base case, and worst case, is that even in our best case scenario, we actually don't anticipate a return to pre-crisis levels until something like middle of the decade, 25, 26, and in our worst case is more likely kind of at the end of the decade for Europe. That's quicker in some regions, so we anticipate that quicker in China. We think quicker even in places like India, and perhaps even in North America a little bit quicker actually there too. But still, I think any forecast says as much about the present as it does about the future. And from what we can anticipate and look at right now, that's some of we expect a pretty deep and long, possible W kind of recovery to some aspects of a U in certain regions, to use that sort of language. So I still wouldn't be making too many bets on forecasts right now, but that's where we see it right now. It's a longer recovery. The good news in terms of our own analysis is we still think that Europe and other regions, but Europe as well, can recover in the longer term, that there is still mobility demand, that there is still vehicle demand, that will be there, but albeit in different formats. And so the longer term growth, including population growth, still allows for recovery, but it's a pretty long road so far as we can see it right now. That's the kind of, if you like, data points which we've looked at. I'll share with our audience again when we publish this video links to those latest forecasts in a lot more detail. You know, anything, if there's anything that you'd want to add to that, Ralf, clearly in terms of, you know, how you and then perhaps, you know, with your clients are looking at it, by all means, happy to hear it. But that's our current forecast, if you like.
Yeah, I think, of course, everyone is hoping for a steep ramp up and some nice sales figures already showing up in 21, 22. Nevertheless, it all depends on scenario and region. Yeah, and of course, nobody really knows. We will see and experience this over the next 3 to 6 months what's happening. Yeah, everything else is real guessing.
Absolutely, and I think it's probably worth talking about, and even in our forecast, when you look into the detail, the month by month and certain recovery periods could look quite different over time as well, if we account for the possibility of government stimulus or scrappage sort of schemes, which we saw at the end in 2009 and 10, which obviously drove big demand recovery for a short period, followed by some kind of, if you like, draw forward of demand, and then so that sort of, you know, W shape could come into effect there. Will depend on some key things. Again, not really time now to speculate on it, but there'll be a lot of questions about how the incentives will work in terms of targeting EVs or lower emissions versus the capacity to build and supply them. So if Europe incentivizes that, will it actually incentivize its production base or incentivize, if you like, imports? So, you know, that's a lot of questions that are going on in the industry right now. And not just in Europe. That'll be questions elsewhere too. So it's a bumpy ride ahead. I think is the easiest way I can sum up that. So that was the questions that we had left over. So clearly, as you saw, you know, the interest and wonder along with what we had then kind of continues. Every week this is going to likely change, so I suspect we'll be coming back to the topics as we get more data on them and can follow more what's happening. Ralf, would love to continue to get your perspective when we can come in and get some updates. We'll certainly be happy to bring you back in. Likewise, obviously, Nick, you know, unfortunately for you, I might just drag you on more and more. So we'll all be, you know, sharing everything that we can. I'd like to just again, so thank the both of you. And just before we sort of close, just sort of, you know, kind of tell everyone again, this is part of our Festival of Transformation, Automotive Festival of Transformation. Not a festival that we're celebrating, if you like. It's a time of change and a time of disruption and a time of coming together by that means as well. So that's part of what this series is about, of the live streams that we're doing, of the focus on particular regions. We're going to we have an updated program coming out for May. A lot more digital stuff where that came from as well. So get involved, get in touch with me, get in touch with Nick on the AMS side, and you know, let's keep the dialogue going. Join us next week. Join us every week really on Wednesdays for our live stream hour. Next week, April 29th, if you're watching it this week, is our April supply chain update. So we've got some more insight from some key experts from across some regions. So you won't want to miss that. Thanks again to Ralf. Thanks again to Nick. I'm going to sign off here from once again sunny London. You know, it seems like as long as we've been on the lockdown, the sun keeps to shine. I'm not sure what that means, but hopefully it's a sign of hope. And let's continue that. And I hope you know you're all keeping well. And let's continue to keep in touch during this time. Thanks again, everyone, and we will see you very soon. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.